most of his career, Mark Carney has been the man behind the curtain of global finance, a central banker's central banker, moving markets with a raised eyebrow rather than a raised voice. So when people who live off interest rates and risk models start using his warnings to frame a phrase as dramatic as financial exodus, it's worth asking what they are really hearing, because no, Carney has not stood at a podium and shouted Goldman Sachs is fleeing to Toronto, but taken together his speeches about political risk, climate risk, and the fragility of Anglo-American financial leadership sketch out a future in which that headline feels less like clickbait and more like a logical endpoint of trends that have been building for years, a United States and a United Kingdom that increasingly weaponize their own unpredictability, and a Canada that quietly offers itself as the boring, rules-based refuge for global capital tired of being dragged into someone else's culture war. To understand why a firm like Goldman Sachs would even weigh Toronto in its calculations, you have to step into Carney's worldview. As governor of the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, he watched two different versions of financial complacency mature into crisis. In 2008, he saw what happens when banks believe growth will last forever and regulators look the other way. In the Brexit years, he saw what happens when politicians treat the legal plumbing of global finance, passporting, clearing rules, data rights, as afterthoughts to their own nationalist theatrics. Over and over, Carney returned to the same theme. Markets hate uncertainty more than they hate almost anything else, and Western democracies were manufacturing more of it than ever. When he talks about the forged consensus of the post-war order coming undone, when he warns that climate inaction will trigger a violent repricing of assets, when he notes that the US and UK are no longer the only game in town for global finance, he is effectively telling executives at places like Goldman, if you anchor your future in jurisdictions that treat the rule of law as negotiable and long-term policy as fodder for tomorrow's outrage cycle, don't be surprised when clients and talent quietly drift somewhere saner. Enter Toronto, the city that for decades New Yorkers and Londoners dismissed as pleasant but provincial, a place of banks with sensible names and glass towers that close on time. While Wall Street and the City of London branded themselves as the sharp edges of capitalism, rapacious, innovative, occasionally corrupt, but always glamorous, Toronto branded itself as something else, as safe, diversified, regulated but not suffocating, plugged into North America but not hostage to Washington's or Westminster's mood swings. Carney, a Canadian who made his reputation in London, embodies that bridge. When he joined the effort to turn Toronto into a hub for green finance and fintech, when he lent his gravitas to arguments that Canada, with its stable politics and relatively sane immigration policy, could be a magnet for talent fleeing Trumpism and Brexit chaos, he was doing more than hometown boosterism. He was quietly reshaping the mental map of where a global financial capital could be. So when a headline blares, Goldman flees to Toronto, what it really describes is a slower, more structural process, the incremental shifting of teams, data centers, trading operations, and back-office functions out of places where the political class delights in threatening to tear up trade agreements, default on debt, or criminalize central bank independence, and into places where the Prime Minister might be dull on TV, but the legal code is not rewritten on social media at 3 in the morning. Goldman is the perfect bellwether for this story because it has always prided itself on being ahead of the curve. Long before ordinary voters heard the words Brexit or Trump tariffs, Goldman was running stress tests on what a hard break with the EU would do to cross-border financial flows, what a trade war would do to supply chains, what a wave of anti-central bank populism would do to interest rate regimes. When London's place in European finance was thrown into question, Goldman began moving staff to Frankfurt and Paris. When Washington started talking casually about using the dollar system as a blunt weapon in every foreign dispute, Goldman's clients in Asia and the Gulf started asking pointed questions about diversification. It is in that context that Toronto appears, not as some sudden panic exit, but as a strategic hedge, a deep pool of human capital, a regulatory environment plugged into global norms, and a location that straddles U.S. markets without being subject to every convulsion of U.S. politics. Carney's speeches about the polycentric future of finance, the idea that instead of one or two hegemonic centers, we will see a network of hubs, sound between the lines like a recruitment pitch for exactly this kind of shift. He is telling banks, do not assume New York and London will be unassailable, build options. The financial exodus language that pundits hang on him is, in some ways, a dramatization of that advice. Exit not as a fire drill, but as a series of decisions that over a decade reduce your exposure to jurisdictions that no longer take their own credibility seriously. When an American administration flirts with defaulting on its own debt ceiling as a bargaining chip, when British governments crash their currency with unfunded tax fantasies, when both countries turn central bankers into political villains, Carney does not scream. He does something more unnerving. He calmly notes that trust, once squandered, does not automatically regenerate. In boardrooms, that line hits like a thunderclap. Trust is what lets you borrow cheaply, clear trade smoothly, move trillions through a system on the assumption that the laws and norms that existed yesterday will exist tomorrow. If Washington or London want to gamble that away, fine, but why should Goldman bear the whole risk? At the same time, Canada has been methodically tightening the bolts that make a place bank-friendly in the 21st century. Its big banks did not collapse in 2008. Its regulators did not pretend that shadow banking would police itself. Its immigration system, while far from perfect, has made it easier for skilled workers, from coders to quants, to plant their lives there. Toronto and Montreal have invested in AI research, fintech incubators, and infrastructure that, while lacking the manic edge of Manhattan, offer something just as valuable: continuity. Carney leverages that in his climate work as well. When he warns that trillions will be stranded if the world does not price carbon properly, he is nudging financial giants to place their green finance desks and sustainable investment units somewhere that takes those warnings seriously in law, not just in glossy reports. Few things shout, "We are serious about the future," louder than a major bank choosing to put the brain of its climate strategy in your time zone under your regulator's eyes. The Goldman flees to Toronto, hook, then, is a way of dramatizing a quieter, more profound argument Carney has been making for years, that in an age of cascading crises, financial, geopolitical, environmental, capital will favor jurisdictions that behave like grown-ups. The United States and the United Kingdom still have enormous advantages: depth of markets, legal sophistication, cultural magnetism, but those can be squandered surprisingly fast if they are treated as permanent birthrights rather than assets that require maintenance. Trump's 4 years in office, followed by the ongoing radicalization of his party, sent a shock through that assumption. Watching a president threaten to fire Fed chairs for not cutting rates fast enough, watching him muse about defaulting on debt to make a deal, watching an insurrection at the Capitol live-streamed around the world, many investors and bankers did what Carney has always urged them to do: update their risk models. Toronto, which had long marketed itself as the calm alternative to New York's volatility, suddenly looked less like a consolation prize and more like a prudent anchor. None of this means Manhattan will empty out, or that Goldman will remove its name from 200 West Street and slap it on a Bay Street tower instead. Global finance does not move like that. It oozes, it seeps, it shifts weight. A few hundred jobs in compliance here, a trading desk there, a data center moved north for redundancy, until one day you look at the maps of internal reporting lines and realize that more of the critical brain work, the algorithms, the risk assessments, the product design, is happening under Canadian regulators than American ones, and that when crises hit, the calls are being routed through Toronto more than through Washington. That is the scenario Carney's critics caricature as an exodus, but it is in many ways just the market doing what he has always said it does best when politics go mad: vote with its feet. For Americans who still assume that Wall Street's dominance is as permanent as the Manhattan skyline, this is the uncomfortable truth embedded in a viral headline about Goldman fleeing to Toronto. It is not that one bank has lost its nerve. It is that a whole class of decision-makers has internalized Carney's central claim that we are moving into a world of competing systems, and those systems will be judged not merely on the size of their GDP, but on the reliability of their governance. If you want to keep the center of gravity of global finance, you cannot keep flirting with default, demonizing expertise, and turning every regulatory tweak into a partisan brawl. If you do not be surprised when the likes of Goldman, reluctantly, quietly, with 1,000 footnotes, start investing their future somewhere Mark Carney has already marked in his speeches as safer ground.